Tonight, we're going deep into the frozen heart of the North to talk about one of the most fascinating and complex houses in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. From their mythical origins in the Age of Heroes, to their bond with direwolves, and even their connection to the old gods, House Stark of Winterfell represents something really quite primal in George R.R. Martin's world. They're an example of ancient honor that's really just struggling to survive in a realm that's becoming increasingly defined by political machination and moral compromise. We'll explore their kings and lords, triumphs and tragedies, and of course their fearsome enemies also. And just take a look at everything that makes them unique among the great houses of Westeros. We can't let the Targaryens have all the fun now. So get cozy, light a fire against the cold, and let's explore the history and lore of House Stark, the Kings of Winter, the Wardens of the North, and potentially the saviors of all mankind. Winter is coming. 3 simple words that carry an unfathomable weight. The other houses have mottos that can easily be taken as boasts or maybe as threats. But this one is a bit different. It's a promise. Essentially, an acknowledgement of the fundamental truth that governs not just the North, but all of Westeros. That darkness will always return, and when it does, someone's got to be ready to face it. As old Nan warns the young Starks, "Oh, my sweet summer child, what do you know of fear? Fear is for the winter, my little lord, when the snows fall 100 feet deep and the ice wind comes howling out of the north. Fear is for the long night, when the sun hides its face for years at a time, and little children are born and live and die all in darkness, while the dire wolves grow gaunt and hungry, and the white walkers move through the woods. And in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the North, home to ancient magic and forgotten gods, there's a fortress that's weathered 8,000 years of storms, wars, and the long night itself, Winterfell. And within its walls, this family, whose very name has become synonymous with duty and the inexorable approach of winter. So, how did all start? Let's go back to the mists of prehistory. This is an age when the continent of Westeros was fundamentally different from the one we know. And picture today when we read the books or watch the shows. It's way before the 7 kingdoms were united under Targaryen rule, and even before the Andals crossed the narrow sea and brought over their 7-pointed star and new faith. The continent was inhabited by 2 very different peoples, locked in a battle to survive. The first inhabitants were the Children of the Forest. They're a mysterious, non-human race who stood no taller than children, but had lifespans that stretched for centuries. These beings had dark skin like bark, big golden or green eyes, and most importantly, they wielded magic. It came very naturally to them too. They could see through the eyes of animals, shape change into beasts, and commune with the ancient weirwood trees. These were massive white-barked trees with red leaves and faces carved into their trunks. The children worshipped these nameless old gods through the weirwoods, believing that the spirits of their ancestors lived on within the trees themselves. Then came the first men, human invaders from across the narrow sea, who brought with them bronze weapons and a hunger for land. I've talked about this in heavy detail in some of my other videos. But what followed was a really long and brutal war. The children used their magic to defend their forests, while the first men cut down the sacred weirwoods and claimed territory for their own. The children could command ravens to carry messages, turn into wolves and bears to fight back. And some among them, special ones called green seers, possessed the ability to see across vast distances and even through time itself using their connection to the weirwood network. But eventually, exhaustion and necessity forced a peace. The pact was signed on the Isle of Faces, dividing the continent between the children who would keep their forests and the first men who could have the open lands. More importantly, many of the first men began to adopt the children's religion, abandoning their own gods to worship at the weirwood trees. It was from this blending of cultures that the Age of Heroes emerged, a legendary period when the great houses of Westeros were founded, and when magic still flowed through the land, at least relative to the present time. It was during this time that Bran the Builder, the legendary founder of House Stark, first raised the walls of Winterfell. But the legends paint Bran as more than just a castle builder. According to northern folklore, he was instrumental in constructing the wall itself, the massive barrier of ice and stone that stretches 300 miles across the northern border of Westeros, standing 700 feet tall. Obviously, this would be total overkill to defend from neighboring houses or some regular enemy, or whatever. It's clear that the wall was built to hold back something much more terrifying. This brings us to the Long Night, arguably the most important event in the prehistory of Westeros, and one that explains why House Stark's motto carries so much weight. 8,000 years ago, according to legend, a darkness fell upon the world that lasted for an entire generation. The sun hid its face, crops failed, and from the uttermost north came creatures of nightmare. The others were also called White Walkers. I don't think it's accurate to say that they're living creatures exactly, but they're most certainly sentient. They're these very tall, gaunt figures, with flesh pale as ice, and eyes like blue stars, who brought with them an endless winter and the power to raise the dead as their servants. When the Night's Watch encounters them in the books, the descriptions are pretty terrifying. The other slid forward on silent feet. In its hand was a long sword, like none that Will had ever seen. No human metal had gone into the forging of that blade. It was alive with moonlight, translucent, a shard of crystal so thin that it seemed almost to vanish when seen edge-on. The others swept south with their army of whites, reanimated corpses that felt no pain, knew no fear, and could only be truly destroyed by fire or weapons forged from dragon glass. The maesters who chronicle history in their great citadel claim the Long Night lasted a generation. But the oral traditions of different cultures tell creepily similar tales of this apocalyptic period. The Dothraki horsemen of Essos speak of a time when ghost grass would cover the world in silver. In the distant east, the people of the Et remember the Lion of Night usurping the Maiden Maid of Light, plunging the world into darkness until a hero wielding a burning sword cast him down. In the north, they remember it as the time when the Star Kings proved themselves to be humanity's shields against oblivion. The legends claim that Bran the Builder worked alongside both the children of the forest and the giants to construct the wall. Of course, it wouldn't just be the physical aspect of the barrier that could protect against an undead army. The wall was actually imbued with ancient magic into its very foundation that would prevent the others from passing. Some texts say that Bran himself possessed the blood of the first men so strongly that he could communicate with the Greentians and tap into the mystical network of the Weirwoods. This connection to magic becomes a defining characteristic of House Stark throughout their history. Unlike the Southern houses, who would later convert to the faith of the Seven, the religion brought by the Andal invaders, the Starks maintained their devotion to the old gods. Every northern castle has a godswood, a sacred grove containing a weirwood tree. But Winterfell's is special. Its heart tree is ancient beyond measure, with a face carved so long ago that the features have become worn and alien, and red sap weeps from its eyes like tears of blood. The Starks also maintain traditions that their southern counterparts abandoned. For example, they preserved the practice of the Lord, who passes the sentence swinging the sword himself, a custom that basically says, if you would take a life, you must look into their eyes and hear their final words. Death carries weight, and those who deal in it must accept its burden. One of the coolest bits of early Stark history is their connection to the creatures of the North. Direwolves are massive wolves, the size of small horses, with intelligence that borders on human, and they were said to be the companions of Stark kings, and not in a hunting companion sort of way. It's, I guess, much more like a Targaryen's bond with their dragon, but based in a different type of magic. Some Starks also possessed the ability of skin changing, slipping their consciousness into the bodies of their wolf companions to see through their eyes and experience their enhanced senses. This ability, passed down through bloodlines touched by the old magic, allowed them to scout vast distances and detect threats that other, more ordinary men couldn't have noticed in time. But aside from their lineage and literal bloodline, the very stones and construction of Winterfell tell the story of a house that had never forgotten the reality of supernatural threats. The castle's crypts extend deep underground, filled with stone statues of Stark kings and lords stretching back thousands of years. Each effigy holds an iron sword across its lap, placed there as wards against the dead. The Starks understand that some enemies, like their ancient undead foes, can't be defeated through political alliances or marriage pacts. You need steel, ancient, secret knowledge. Winterfell is built over natural hot springs that keep its halls warm throughout the brutal northern winters. But some more practical masters attribute this to volcanic activity under the earth. There's also the more mystical explanations owing to the Stark history. The small folk say that dragons sleep deep beneath the castle, and it's their breath warming the stones. But honestly, this is probably just small folk nonsense. The ideas that hold more weight, in my opinion, are the ones that suggest Winterfell was built over a site already sacred to the children of the forest. A place where the barrier between the physical world and the realm of spirits grows thin, which would explain why the Starks have always seemed more attuned to supernatural forces than their southern counterparts, even long after magic had left the world. I like that the mix of practical and mystical is what defines the Stark approach to lordship. I mean, yes, they are political rulers who've still got to manage territories and collect taxes and keep the peace with other houses and all that modern kingdom stuff. But you can't forget that they're guardians of ancient knowledge, keepers of traditions that may seem primitive to southern sensibilities, but which carry the hard-won wisdom of 8,000 years of survival in the harshest environment in Westeros, against enemies that other houses have long forgotten about. or even doubt their existence in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because for millennia, before Aegon the Conqueror ever dreamed of uniting the Seven Kingdoms, the Starks ruled the North as kings. The Kings of Winter had their own challenges to take care of. There were ice spiders the size of hounds that could freeze a man's blood with their bite, giants who could ride mammoths into battle, could hurl boulders, and whose clubs could shatter castle gates, and even stranger things lurking in the deepest woods, where maybe even the children of the forest feared to go. I think it's pretty plausible, since the northern reaches extend really far, and we don't know what's actually beyond the lands of always winter. There's a quote from the books about Bran's dream that I find really interesting and a bit unnerving too. It says, "And he looked past the wall, past endless forests cloaked in snow, past the frozen shore and the great blue-white rivers of ice and the dead plains where nothing grew or lived, to the curtain of light at the end of the world, and then beyond that curtain. He looked deep into the heart of winter, and then he cried out, afraid. And the heat of his tears burned on his cheeks." A rather mysterious and controversial figure in early Northern history is the Night's King. To avoid any confusion, I want to make it clear that this isn't the same as the Night King from the Game of Thrones show. So according to Old Nan's Tales and different in-universe historical accounts, he was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who fell in love with a woman described as having skin as white as the moon and eyes like blue stars, a description that strongly suggests she was one of the others. This Night's King ruled from the Night Fort, the largest castle on the wall, for 13 years, making sacrifices to the others and ruling through dark magic and terror. So what makes this legend actually relevant for House Stark is how it ended. The Night's King was eventually brought down by an alliance between a King of Winter, a Stark named Brandon the Breaker, and Joramun, the King beyond the wall. After his defeat, all records of the Night's King's true name were ordered destroyed. Some versions of the tale, like the one from Old Nan, suggest he was a Stark himself, possibly a younger brother of Brandon the Breaker, who had been sent to the wall. If true, this would mean House Stark was responsible for both creating and destroying one of the most dangerous threats in Northern history. The Starks also waged wars against several enemies throughout their long reign as kings. Not just the undead. They conquered the Marsh Kings who ruled the Neck, bringing the Crannogmen under their dominion. The Crannogmen were known for their guerrilla warfare tactics, stealthing through the swamplands and fighting alongside lizard lions, massive crocodilian creatures native to the marshes. Another legendary conflict involved the Warg King, but details about this one are a bit scarce in the historical record. The name makes me think he was a powerful skin changer who could control multiple animals, making him a formidable opponent for the Starks, who, as we covered, were themselves known to have skin-changing abilities in their bloodline. One of the most historically documented Kings of Winter was Theon Stark, known as the Hungry Wolf. Around 2,000 years ago, when Andal raiders began attacking the northern coasts, Theon sailed across the narrow sea with his own fleet, burned the Andal towns that had launched the raids, and according to legend, fed some of the captured Andal leaders to his wolves. This action effectively ended Andal attempts to conquer or raid the north, as they turned their attention to easier targets in the south. The Starks also faced threats from wildling kings beyond the Wall. Raymond Redbeard, a king beyond the Wall, managed to lead his people over the Wall and deep into the north, around 200 years before Aegon's conquest. He was eventually stopped at Long Lake by the combined forces of the Starks and their bannermen, though not before causing significant damage. Raymond himself was killed by Artos Stark, who would later be known as the Implacable. As with everywhere else in Westeros, the gradual decline of magic in the world affected the Starks as well. Direwolves, which were once common throughout the north, became very rare, retreating to the deepest wilderness areas. The giants who had once helped build the wall retreated beyond it entirely. The children of the forest, who had made peace with the first men thousands of years earlier, largely disappeared from human lands. The year 1 AC marked the end of an era that had lasted 8 millennia. Aegon Targaryen, known to history as Aegon the Conqueror, landed on the shores of Westeros with his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys, 3 dragons, and a small army. The conquests that followed reshaped the political landscape of the continent forever. And for House Stark, it meant the end of their ancient independence. When Aegon began his conquest, Torrhen Stark was the King of Winter, ruling from Winterfell as his ancestors had done for thousands of years. To be fair, the situation he was facing was completely unprecedented for House Stark. Previous threats had come from wildlings beyond the Wall, rival kings within Westeros, or supernatural enemies that had at least been driven back once before. But dragons were something else entirely. The southern kingdoms had already learned this lesson the hard way. At the Field of Fire, the combined armies of the Reach and the Rock, consisting of over 55,000 men, had been routed by a much smaller Targaryen force when all 3 dragons took to the battlefield. King Mern Gardner of the Reach and King Loren Lannister of the Rock had both fled the field, though only Loren survived. The supposedly impregnable castle of Harrenhal had been reduced to stone and slag in a single night. Torrhen Stark wasn't dumb. Unlike some of the southern kings who had charged headlong into the destruction, the King of Winter understood the reality of the situation. He had already called his banners and marched south with an army of 30,000 Northmen. But as he reached the banks of the Trident and saw the Targaryen host across the river, with Balerion the Black Dread, Vhagar, and Meraxes circling overhead, he made a decision to save the North from the devastation that had befallen other kingdoms. The meeting between Torrhen Stark and Aegon Targaryen took place on neutral ground between the armies. What exactly was said during their conference remains unknown to history, but the outcome was clear. Torrhen knelt before Aegon, surrendering his crown and accepting the Targaryen as his king. For this act, history would remember him as Torrhen, the king who knelt. A title that some might consider shameful, but realistically, it's the only reason House Stark stayed in power. Unlike the Gardeners, who had chosen death over submission and saw their ancient bloodline ended, or the Durandons of Storm's End, who fought and lost their independence anyway, the Starks preserved both their lives and their position as the paramount house of the North. Aegon, recognizing both the wisdom of Torrhen's submission and the value of keeping experienced rulers in place, named him Warden of the North, a position that would remain with House Stark for the next 3 centuries. The transition from independent kingdom to Targaryen vassal required some pretty significant adjustments for House Stark. They retained control over the north and continued to hold court at Winterfell. But they now owed military service to the Iron Throne and were required to send taxes south. But the remoteness of the north and the practical difficulties of governing such a big, sparsely populated region meant that day-to-day life changed relatively little for most Northerners. The Starks continued to follow the old gods, maintain their godswood, and practice their traditional customs. The Iron Throne was far away in King's Landing, and as long as the North provided its required levies and taxes, the Targaryens were generally content to let the Starks govern as they always had. The Stark family adapted to their new role as great lords rather than kings. They served the Targaryen dynasty faithfully, providing troops for wars and conflicts throughout the centuries that followed. When called upon, northern armies marched south to fight in the Targaryens' wars, but they always returned to Winterfell when the campaigns ended. A big test of Stark loyalty came during the Faith Militant uprising against King Maega Targaryen, known as Maegor the Cruel. The Faith Militant were religious warriors who opposed Targaryen rule and especially hated their practice of polygamy and incest, which violated the teachings of the Faith of the Seven. But since the North followed the old gods rather than the Seven, they had no religious objection to Targaryen practices. And besides, even though they didn't exactly have love for Maegor's brutal ways, they understood that religious civil war would bring chaos and suffering to all of Westeros. And so, the Starks stayed loyal to the Iron Throne during this period, helping to suppress the uprising and demonstrating that their oath of fealty was genuine. Then came the biggest crisis in Targaryen history, and the one that would again test the Stark loyalty. This was the Dance of Dragons, the devastating civil war that tore the realm apart from 129 to 131 AC. When King Viserys I died, two claimants emerged for the Iron Throne. One was his daughter Rhaenyra, whom he had named as his heir, and his son Aegon II, whom the small council crowned after Viserys' death. The realm split between the Blacks, supporting Rhaenyra, and the Greens, supporting Aegon. Lord Cregan Stark, known as the Old Wolf, found himself in a tough spot. The North's military strength was considerable, and whichever side secured Stark support would gain a significant advantage. But Cregan was very cautious and focused on the long-term welfare of his people, rather than immediate political gain. Initially, he was slow to commit to either side. The North was far from the centers of conflict, and he had no desire to march his armies south to die in what many saw as a purely dynastic dispute. And especially being a Northerner, he knew that being divided would only weaken them ahead of the true threat of the Long Night. However, he had sworn an oath to support Rhaenyra's claim. And when Jace Velaryon, Rhaenyra's son, flew north on his dragon Vermax to personally request aid, Cregan honored that commitment. The meeting between the Dragon Prince and the Wolf of Winterfell resulted in the Pact of Ice and Fire. The pact included several provisions. The North would provide 2,000 men to fight for Rhaenyra, called Greybeards because they were older men whose deaths would not deprive the North of its future. In return, Jace agreed that when he became king, he would send a daughter to marry Cregan's heir. More immediately practical for the war effort, Jace also left behind dragon eggs, but these proved to be useless, The eggs had turned to stone long ago. Cregan's army, though relatively small by the standards of the dance, was composed of hardened Northmen who proved their worth in battle. But by the time they reached the south, the war was essentially over. Both Rhaenyra and Aegon II were dead, along with most of their dragons and many of their supporters. The realm was exhausted, traumatized, and in desperate need of stable leadership. With King Aegon III still a child and the realm in chaos, someone needed to take charge. Cregan Stark, as one of the few major lords who still commanded a significant military force and whose loyalty was unquestioned, took a new position of power. For 6 days, he served as Hand of the King, a period that would be remembered as the Hour of the Wolf. During his brief tenure as Hand, Cregan demonstrated the Northern approach to justice and governance. He worked quickly to restore order, pardoning some participants in the war while demanding justice for the most awful crimes. He also ordered the execution of several men who had betrayed their oaths or committed particularly heinous acts during the conflict. The Hour of the Wolf ended when Cregan voluntarily relinquished power and returned north, refusing offers to remain as Hand or to claim greater rewards for his service. This decision really reflects the Stark approach to power. They would accept responsibility when duty demanded it, but they had no desire to accumulate authority for its own sake. Cregan's voluntary return to Winterfell earned him enormous respect throughout the realm and established a precedent for Stark behavior that would influence their family's reputation for generations. The aftermath of the Dance of Dragons marked a turning point in Targaryen rule. The dynasty had lost most of its dragons during the Civil War, and with them much of their mystical authority. The realm they ruled was more conventional, more dependent on traditional forms of power, like military strength and political alliances. In this new environment, houses like the Starks, with their reputation for reliability and competence, became even more valuable to the crown. Throughout the later Targaryen period, the Starks continued to serve faithfully as wardens of the North. They participated in various royal progress tours when kings visited the North, though these were relatively rare given the distance and difficulty of travel. One aspect of this period that's often overlooked is how the integration with the southern kingdoms affected northern society. Some northern lords began sending younger sons to serve at court in King's Landing, while southern knights occasionally married into northern families. This did create connections that would prove important in later generations. The Starks also maintained their traditional role as guardians of the realm's northern border. The Night's Watch continued to man the wall, and the North provided a steady stream of recruits to the Order, while the others were largely forgotten in the South, becoming the stuff of children's stories. The North never entirely forgot the ancient threats that lurked beyond the wall. The Starks continued to take their responsibilities to the Night's Watch seriously, providing supplies and support, even when the rest of the realm showed little interest in the Wall's mission. The end of House Stark's long partnership with House Targaryen eventually came, and it was through a betrayal so deep that it shattered nearly 3 centuries of loyalty. The reign of Aerys Targaryen II, better known as the Mad King, was to be the final chapter of dragon rule in Westeros, and House Stark played a big part in bringing down the dynasty they had served faithfully for so long. The problem began with what seemed like a simple tournament at Harrenhal in 281 AC. Lord Walter Went had organized the tourney, which featured the largest purse ever offered and attracted knights and lords from across the realm. Among the competitors was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the Crown Prince, an heir to the Iron Throne. Rhaegar was widely regarded as everything his father was not. He was handsome, intelligent, cultured, and seemingly stable. Many hoped he would make a way better king than Aerys. But the tournament took an unexpected turn when Prince Rhaegar won the competition, and then, in front of thousands of witnesses, rode past his own wife, Elia Martell of Dawn, to present the crown of winter roses to Lyanna Stark, the daughter of Lord Rickard Stark and sister to his heir Brandon. This public slight to Princess Elia was shocking enough. But for those who knew how to read the signs, it meant something much more dangerous was brewing. Lyanna Stark was already betrothed to Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End and one of the most powerful young lords in the realm. Robert was known for his prowess in battle, his legendary appetites, and his fierce temperament. The idea that Prince Rhaegar might have romantic designs on Robert's intended bride was a political powder keg. The explosion came the following year when Lyanna disappeared. Whether she was abducted by Rhaegar or went with him willingly is a big old mystery in Westeros. But the immediate assumption throughout the realm was that the prince had kidnapped and assaulted the Stark girl. For her family, this was an intolerable insult that demanded immediate action. Brandon Stark, Lyanna's older brother and heir to Winterfell, reacted without thinking. Instead of returning north to consult with his father or trying to resolve the matter through negotiation, he rode straight to King's Landing with several companions and demanded that Rhaegar come out and die. This public challenge to the Crown Prince in the very heart of the capital was a really big deal. King Aerys, whose madness had been growing worse for years, saw Brandon's challenge as treason against the crown rather than the desperate act of a brother scared for his sister's safety. He had Brandon and his companions arrested and thrown into the dungeons. When word reached Winterfell, Lord Rickard Stark had no choice but to travel south to answer the king's summons and try to secure his son's release. The Mad King accused both Rickard and Brandon of treason and declared that they would face trial by combat. But instead of appointing a champion to fight for the crown, Aerys declared that fire would be his champion. Lord Rickard Stark was suspended from the rafters of the throne room in his armor, while a fire was lit beneath him, slowly roasting him alive. Brandon was forced to watch with a noose around his neck and a sword just out of reach. The more he struggled to save his father, the tighter the noose became until he strangled himself trying to reach the blade. The murders of Rickard and Brandon Stark were acts of pure madness that violated the law. Lords who came to court under the king's protection were supposed to be safe, and trial by combat was meant to be a fight between warriors, not an execution by torture. But the king wasn't finished with his depravity. He then sent demands to Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie, demanding that he send him the heads of his 2 wards. Eddard Stark, now the last surviving son of House Stark, and Robert Baratheon, whose betrothed had supposedly been kidnapped by the prince. This demand finally pushed the realm past the breaking point. Jon Arryn had raised both Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon as his own sons, and he had no intention of murdering them to satisfy a madman's paranoia. Instead, he called his banners and raised them in rebellion against the Iron Throne. The killing of Rickard and Brandon Stark had provided the perfect justification for what many lords had wanted to do for years, and remove the increasingly unstable Targaryen king from power. The war that came after was called Robert's Rebellion. Jon Arryn, Robert Baratheon, Eddard Stark, and Hoster Tully all raised their banners against the crown. The war would rage for over a year and would see some of the most famous battles in recent Westerosi history. Eddard Stark, who I'll be referring to as Ned sometimes, was now Lord of Winterfell at barely 20 years old, and proved himself worthy of his family's ancient reputation. The northern armies he led were smaller than those fielded by the southern kingdoms, but they were disciplined, well-trained, and fighting for a cause they believed in. The murder of their liege lord and his heir had outraged every northerner, and they followed young Ned Stark with the same loyalty their ancestors had shown the Kings of Winter. The rebellion's crucial turning point came at the Battle of the Trident, where Robert Baratheon faced Prince Rhaegar in single combat. The prince, who had started the whole crisis, fell to Robert's warhammer. With Rhaegar dead, the Targaryen cause was effectively lost. But the war continued for several more months. The final act was when Tywin Lannister, who had remained neutral for most of the conflict, finally declared for Robert and marched on King's Landing. The sacking of the capital ended with the murder of the Mad King by his own Kingsguard, Jaime Lannister, and the deaths of Prince Rhaegar's wife and children at the hands of Lannister men. For House Stark, victory came at an enormous cost. Lord Rickard and Brandon were dead. Lyanna had died under mysterious circumstances during the war, and Eddard found himself the sole surviving member of his generation. The house that had ruled the North for 8,000 years was reduced to a single young man. But Ned Stark proved equal to the burden. His performance during the rebellion had earned him the respect of his fellow lords and established him as one of the most important figures in the new regime. When Robert Baratheon took the Iron Throne, he named Eddard Stark as his hand, giving the young lord enormous power and influence in the new kingdom. But Ned declined the honor. Like his ancestor Cregan Stark during the Hour of the Wolf, he had no desire to accumulate power. His duty was to the north and to rebuilding his shattered house. He returned to Winterfell to marry Catelyn Tully, his brother's intended bride, and to start the work of healing the wounds left by the uprising. There were around 15 years between Robert's rebellion and the events that would plunge the realm into another devastating war. Under Eddard Stark's leadership, the North enjoyed peace and prosperity. Having seen firsthand how quickly political situations could spiral into violence and how the innocent people usually paid the highest price, he focused on building a stable, just society that could weather future storms. His marriage to Catelyn proved to be both politically successful and personally fulfilling. Catelyn brought valuable connections to the southern kingdoms through her family ties, while her intelligence complemented Ned's leadership. More importantly, for the long-term survival of the house, they produced 5 children, one after another: Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. After generations of the Stark line hanging by a thread, the future of the house secure. But one shadow fell across this domestic happiness. Ned came back one day with a bastard son named Jon Snow. This was totally out of character for a man known for his honor and fidelity. And Ned's refusal to discuss Jon's mother created tension in his marriage and persistent rumors throughout the North. The truth about Jon's parentage that he was actually the son of Lyanna Stark and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was Ned's most carefully guarded secret, one that he believed would cost the boy his life if revealed. This is very heavily hinted at in the books, but it's not been made explicitly canon yet, like they did in the show. Ned also maintains a North's traditional relationship with the Night's Watch, and he was one of the few lords who still took the organization seriously, while the rest of the realm had largely forgotten about the Wall and its purpose, viewing the Night's Watch as a dumping ground for criminals and unwanted sons. Ned understood that it served a vital function. He regularly visited Castle Black, provided supplies and support, and even honored the men who served there with his presence. His bastard son, Jon's decision to join the Night's Watch was supported by Ned, who recognized both the honor in the choice and the practical benefits of having a Stark presence on the Wall. The peaceful years were interrupted by several events. The one worth actually mentioning was Greyjoy's rebellion in 289 AC, when Balon Greyjoy declared the Iron Islands independent from the Iron Throne. The rebellion was relatively brief, but required the combined forces of the Crown to suppress. Ned led the northern armies south once again, fighting alongside his old friend, King Robert, and other loyal lords to crush the uprising. When Balon Greyjoy's stronghold of Pike fell, his youngest son, Theon, was taken as a hostage to ensure the island's future loyalty. Ned accepted responsibility for the boy and brought him to Winterfell, where Theon was raised alongside the Stark children. Theon was treated more as a ward than a hostage, becoming almost like another son to Ned, despite his status as essentially a prisoner. Throughout this period, Ned stayed good friends with King Robert, though the years had changed both men a lot. Robert had grown fat and increasingly dissolute, more interested in hunting, drinking, and visiting brothels than in the actual business of ruling. His marriage to Cersei Lannister was loveless and political, producing 3 children, but little happiness. And those children weren't even his own, but we'll get to that in a bit. And he was still fixated on the past, still haunted by his love for Lyanna Stark and his hatred for the Targaryens. Meanwhile, Ned had matured into a responsible lord and father, and had moved forward with his life. This brings us to the timeline we're more familiar with, like the events in Game of Thrones. The arrival of King Robert Baratheon at Winterfell in 298 AC started the beginning of the end for the House Stark that Eddard had so carefully rebuilt. What should have been a nice and happy reunion between old friends turned into the catalyst for a series of events that would scatter the Stark family across the known world and bring their ancient house closer to extinction than it had come since the Long Night itself. Robert's visit, to be fair, came with great honor. He intended to name Ned as his Hand of the King again, the second most powerful position in the realm. But the offer carried with it a web of complications that Ned, for all his wisdom in northern affairs, was ill-equipped to handle. The capital had become a nest of vipers, where honor was seen as weakness, and it was all about spies and backstabbing. And then young Bran Stark, while climbing the walls of Winterfell, witnessed Queen Cersei and her brother Jaime Lannister in a very compromising position. Jaime's response was to push the boy from the tower, with the full intent of killing him, to protect the secret that Cersei's children were not Robert's, but were actually his. Bran survived the fall, but remained unconscious. and when an assassin later tried to finish the job with a Valyrian steel dagger. It became clear that powerful forces were moving against House Stark. Catelyn Stark's investment